Hey there, friends. Welcome back to another episode of the Bible in Life podcast. My name is John Whitaker. I'm here with my friend Stephen Norris, and we have been having conversations over the last handful of weeks around this idea of discipleship to Jesus. What does it mean to live as a disciple? What's the aim of living with as a disciple? And so what we've really talked about is that the method or manner of discipleship is really, it centers on attachment to Jesus and doing a with Jesus life. We've talked about that, being with Jesus. And we've focused a lot over particularly the last couple of weeks, on the goal of discipleship, which is becoming like Jesus, and embodying the way of Jesus in our everyday, ordinary life. So that's been the focus the last handful of weeks as Stephen and I have talked about these kinds of things. So, hey there, Stephen. Welcome back. And I
Hey,
think
John.
we have a good conversation planned for this episode as well. So, welcome, Stephen.
Yeah, thanks, John. It's good to see you again.
Yeah,
Good to chat with you again. Um, as we wrapped up the last episode, we were talking about grace, and just as I walk away from each of these, I tend to do some indexing and thinking of what are we going to talk about next. And it kind of hit me that it seems like we have spent quite a bit of time talking about what does it mean to be like Jesus in terms of his character,
hmm
which I think we've had some good conversations about that. Um, but I think it's worth talking about what does it look like to be like Jesus in terms of joining him on his mission. And that could be, we can take that a couple ways. I think um, first we can just talk about what is his mission, but also how does he carry it out? Like what do we actually read about him doing? How
yeah,
does he what method does he use to carry out his mission?
okay,
So those are a couple thoughts I had
yeah, yeah, and
as we talked last.
that's really important. I mean, it's easy to get focused on the character component of becoming like Jesus. In fact, a lot of the spiritual growth or spiritual disciplines or spiritual formation books I've read, that's been the whole focus. And over the course of my life, as I've read those books and practiced trying to live as a disciple, one of the things that has struck me is when I focus purely on trying to embody the character of Jesus, my spiritual formation almost becomes egocentric, becomes kind of self-centered, right? Self-serving. Um, and I think that's antithetical ultimately to being like Jesus. So I do think focusing on not just the character of Jesus, but the mission of Jesus is really, really important for us to kind of wrestle with. And think through, okay, so if we're going to be like Jesus, then part of that is embodying not just his character, but the kind of stuff he did and what really matters to him and what he's trying to accomplish in the world. So I'm guessing that's what you mean by joining him in his mission.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. So what's your initial? How does that hit you? What's your initial thoughts on just
Yeah.
overarching? What is his mission, and how do we see him carrying it out?
Yeah. Yeah, in all honesty, I actually find this piece of the discipleship and becoming like Jesus component a little more challenging. In some regards, I think the character is a little bit more clear in the sense that there is sort of a one size template for everybody, right? Like Jesus has a certain kind of character. It's described for us in the New Testament in various lists and in various ways. And so that gives us a very clear target. But when it comes to the mission of Jesus, I'm not so sure it's quite as one size fits all, that there's the same template for everybody. So I do think it gets a little bit harder to get our hands on. And in fact, I think you could ask a number of Christians, you could even ask a number of church leaders and say, okay, so what is the mission of Jesus? Right? Like what is his mission? What is your part in his mission? And you probably are going to get some different answers from different people, you know. So it's common, for example, in churches to say, well, the mission of Jesus is, he's trying to get us to love God and love our neighbor as ourselves, right? The two greatest commandments.
Mhm.
Maybe it's that. Or the mission of Jesus was, well, Jesus came by his own mission to seek and save that which was lost. Is that
Yep.
the mission of Jesus we're supposed to join? Um, Obviously, the dominant mission that Jesus gave his apostles and thus his church at the end of his life before he ascended back to the Father was go and make disciples of all the nations, baptizing them in the name of the Father, Son, and Spirit, teaching them to obey everything I command you. That's kind of the impetus behind this whole series of discipleship. Um, and interestingly, you never see commands in the New Testament letters written to the churches. You never see the apostles telling other Christians to make disciples,
Yeah,
which I don't think that negates Jesus' mission that he gave to the apostles in the church. I just think it forces us to think about what is each of our part as a piece of God's people to play in that overarching mission, right? And all that.
yeah,
So what's my initial take on joining Jesus in mission? My initial take is it's a little less clear than I wish it was, right?
sure.
And it's a little
Yeah, just in
challenging.
those last couple minutes, you even spurred on multiple other thoughts about it that I hadn't had yet. I was thinking about the body of Christ and how we all have our own part to play, and that's wrapped up in his mission, establishing the kingdom. That was his mission, and so there's a lot of facets to it. Um, I think my initial thinking was just the spreading of the good news
Yeah.
is kind of where after our last conversation, that's kind of where my mind went. Was we talked about character, but we should also talk about how did Jesus go about sharing the good news with people and
Yeah.
speaking truth in love.
Yeah. Yeah. So let me jump in right there. When we talk about spreading the good news, I mean, that's a nice, broad, general phrase. It raises the question, what is the good news?
Hmm.
And again, I think if you talk to a handful of different Christians, you might get slightly different answers, right? Good news, gospel, um, evangelism. What is the good news? What are we talking about? And again, you have sort of the I don't know, individualistic or zoomed in version, like the narrow version of the good news, helping other people become followers of Jesus, helping them be redeemed, restored, reconciled to God, right? Good news. But then there's the kind of the macro level good news where what Jesus ultimately wants to do is to restore all things. That includes humanity, but it's bigger than humanity. And so spreading the good news, I think, ultimately comes down to spreading the story of what God has done and is doing in and through Jesus. And I think that's really important to say it like that because when you read through the book of Acts, which is the apostles after the time of Jesus trying to carry out his mission
Yeah,
and to spread the good news, and they don't go tell people to join a church. They don't even go give people a moral code. What they do is they go and announce news about Jesus that he is King and Lord, risen from the dead, and he is calling all people to basically get rid of their hostilities towards himself and to God and rearrange themselves under his kingship and his authority. That's that's the good news the apostles go and share in the book of Acts. So if we're going to spread the good news, in some form or fashion, that's what it entails, is announcing the news that Jesus is king, and that his kingship has implications for each of our lives.
hmm, yeah. And I think um, what naturally has to come with that is what does that look like? For Jesus as a first century Jewish carpenter that looked a certain way. But now, you know, modern era, I work in radiology and you work from home as a YouTuber and podcaster, and our wives do different things. And so it's gonna how we take part in that with Jesus on that mission is gonna look a little bit different for everybody. And I don't think it all needs to look exactly the same, right?
Yep. And I think really important. And that kind of circles us back to where I was getting at is I'm not so sure there's one template for everybody.
Right.
So, your wife, uh, she's a wife, she's a mom of two girls. She has a small little part-time kind of business that she herself does, right?
Hmm.
She is a part of a church body. Those are some of the various roles that she plays. What would it look like for her to participate in the kingship of Jesus in such a way that it helps people know that Jesus really is king? It's going to look different
Right.
for her than it is for other people.
Yep.
Plus, you add to it her temperament, her opportunities, her
Hmm.
abilities. It might look a
Hmm.
little different for her. And I just think that's so important to give people the freedom that you don't all have to be on the street corner passing out tracts and announcing, turn or burn or anything like that. That may not even be the best way to announce that Jesus is king, right? So
Right.
it's going to look different depending on where we live, what our stage of life is, what our abilities are, what our opportunities are. I think it's going to look different for each one of us.
Yeah. Well, I guess that leads me to what are the that shouldn't let anyone off the hook either, right? So what are the underlying principles that, even though our context is all going to be different, what are the underlying principles that are going to be true of every of us or every one of us? One I know for sure is intentionality.
Yeah.
Like you're purposely living in such a way that you are interacting in such a way that people who don't know God are hearing about it and seeing him through you. You're doing
Yeah.
that on purpose.
Let me ask you, because it's been a handful of years since I worked in a quote unquote secular job, whereas you work as you said in radiology, so you're around unbelievers a lot more than I am.
Yeah.
So what does that intentionality look like for you? How do you, as you said, intentionally or purposefully live in such a way that people are hearing about and seeing the news that Jesus is king in and through you?
Yeah. That's a really good question. I actually lead a team of about 40 people. And so I get to interact with them in a lot of different ways, in group settings, of course. But I also really purposely try to interact with them one on one so that there's a little more space to just talk about what's going on in their life, just to build a little. I'm a relationship builder
Yeah.
style evangelist, I guess.
Hmm.
I'm not a street corner preacher
Yeah.
by any means. Um, but just earlier this week, I was able to put my hand on someone's shoulder and pray for them because were having they have surgery on Wednesday, and um, that was the last time I was going to see him before their surgery. And so I just asked them if that was okay, and they said that'd be great, and I was able to do that. So there's little ways like that, and then also just little ways talking about um, decisions I make about what I do on the weekends and how I, organize my free time and how I interact with my kids and how I
Yeah.
love my wife. And there's a lot of little ways that don't necessarily even say, any Christian language or the name Jesus at all that people can tell are different,
Yeah.
just in the way that I speak highly of my wife or, those things. But I also try to really let people know that, um, I was at church on Sunday and this is these are
Yeah.
things I care about, and I have life group, and we care for each other, and I'm helping somebody move this weekend because they don't have help, and
Yeah.
a lot of things like that.
And
We're
I
really
think,
looking for those one-on-one opportunities.
yeah. I think those kinds of things that you're describing are in some ways are almost like pre-evangelism, right? They're
Yeah,
whetting people's appetite. They're building the rapport. They're creating a context in which maybe it's you get the opportunity because they're willing to ask for advice or share their life with you.
yeah,
And so you're kind of setting the stage, hoping there's a chance where you can finally say to them, the reason I treat my wife the way I do, or the reason I deal with my kids the way I do, is because I'm convinced Jesus is king and his way is the best. And he's taught me how to love like that because he loves me the same way. And so you've set the stage, hopefully, to build that kind of opportunity, right?
yeah,
And I think, again, that's where our individual opportunities and abilities. I think of my wife, who she's a task oriented person. She is friendly and kind and nice, but she's not like deeply relational. That's just not the way she's wired. But one of the things she's super gifted at, so much so that it comes so natural to her, she can't understand why I think it's such a big deal because it's so easy for her, right? But it's not easy for a lot of the rest of us. And that is seeing the needs of other people and then just intuitively knowing how to meet that need. That's just something she just comes natural to her.
hmm,
So, she just today we're having this house built, right? And our liaison, kind of the public facing person that works with us from the building company, she just texted him, "Hey, I know you guys are getting ready to move too, and you're moving about a month or a month and a half after us. Would you want all our packing boxes and paper after we're done with them in September?" And he was
hmm,
like, "That would be awesome and fantastic. And that's incredibly thoughtful." I didn't
yeah,
even consider that as a possibility. For my wife, it
yeah,
just made perfect sense to do it. Those
yeah,
sorts of things just communicate a sense of kindness, compassion, thoughtfulness, and love that can stand out. And maybe he knows I'm a Bible teacher and all that, right? Like, that's
hmm,
really thoughtful, It could plant a seed, it could whet the appetite, right? And I think that's
yeah,
really important. In fact, I just finished reading a book called The Surprising Rebirth of Belief in God. Just wrote a book review for that for Renew. And I really appreciated this comment. The author's name is Justin Brierly. And what he said in the book was he said, we're at a stage in history where evangelism starts not with all the apologetic evidence for why Jesus is true. It starts with getting people to want to believe in God. You got to get them to want to believe in God. And some of those acts of kindness, those simple prayers, those taking a genuine interest in your employees, those sending a text to the neighbor who just let them know you're thinking about them and I know whatever, anything I do for you, at least lets
yep,
them know there are people out there who genuinely care. And it seems like maybe they know this guy named Jesus, and maybe it can make them want to believe, right?
yep, yeah, exactly. I think that that's been my MO, and I feel like it's opened a lot of doors because people have often, over time, eventually asked like, "How did you keep so calm in that situation?" Or "How did you?" Those kinds of questions come up, and then the trust is built, the relationship is there,
Yep.
and the foundation is has been laid, and then I can just tell them
Yeah.
clearly, and that's when it goes from pre-evangelism to real evangelism.
Yeah. And both are important, but at some point you are gonna, hopefully, prayerfully get the opportunity to share the news, right?
Yep,
To announce the news. And if you don't do that, then you're just another coworker who, wow, he's different and he's nice, but they have no reason to know why, right? And
yep,
they're not invited to join you in figuring out why.
yep,
Um, and I think, again, everyone's situation is different. I think of my mom at 81. Her life is a little bit different than somebody at 21. And so based on your stage of life, based on your opportunities, based on the relational connections you have, based on your wiring, how can you join Jesus in his mission of inviting people into the kingdom of God, announcing the news that Jesus is king, inviting people to say, hey, and this kingdom, this is where the real good stuff happens. This is where you can be loved. This is where you can find joy. This is where you can find life like you've never known it before, life now and life forever. I want to invite you into that, And so I think each of us needs to humble ourselves before God, like you said, and we can't be let off the hook. So what does
Yeah.
it look like as a disciple to prayerfully consider, okay, Lord Jesus, would you lead me and show me how I can join you in your mission? And you never, it may be something you never, counted on or looked for.
Yeah.
It may be something you would have never dreamed of. It may be something that's like, well, I'm not naturally inclined this way or gifted at it, but all of a sudden I see Jesus working here and it's good. And so
Yeah.
I think as disciples, we have to own that responsibility.
Yeah. Yeah. One other quick example before we kind of wrap up this episode is some really good friends of mine, Chris and Emily, recently were kind of feeling the urge or the call to just um, basically jump out of what our church calls life groups, in the standard practice, because they just want the freedom to be able to invite people over like at the drop of a hat. That's their thing. And so they have total strangers over to their house once or twice a week. And they have awesome stories to share out of those conversations. And um, I think that's something they picked up from Jesus too.
Yeah.
Was doing over meals and
Jesus had a
just
lot of
being,
meals with a lot of lost people. That's right.
yeah, yeah. So that's how it looks for them. And I think a lot of people could use that. Everyone's got to eat. Everyone's got to um, have connection with people. And doing it over food that's a pretty easy gateway into that world to just invite people over for a meal or coffee or something like that.
Yeah.
It's a quick and
Yeah.
easy
No,
one.
that's great. And I know in my situation, kind of as pastor, right, professional Christian sort of thing, because of that, I I get emails from people who are wrestling with their faith.
Mm-hmm.
I get coffee questions, right? With, people, could we get together and have coffee because, or I get my child is, in fact, I got an email just a week and a half ago, which it's actually a text. I'm guessing his dad must still have my phone number. I have no idea. It was a kid who, probably kid. Now he's probably 23, but he texted me and he's like, it just hit me that you were the first person to ever share the gospel with me when my dad and I sat down with you at Chick-fil-A 10 years ago. 10 years ago.
Wow.
He was
Wow.
13 years old. He was struggling with faith. His dad said, I think maybe John can help you. So we sat down and I answered some of his questions a decade ago. And somehow in the last year, he gave his life to Jesus and then recalled that conversation and wanted to encourage me by sending me that text. And it's like, it was years
Wow.
ago,
That's
right?
awesome.
You never know, but it grew out of my professional Christian life where his dad was like, let's sit down with John. I think you would enjoy talking to him and he might be able to help. Right. And so
Yeah.
again, it's just being available, using the opportunities the Lord has given you and recognizing I have a role to play. And it's not like I don't think we should think of joining Jesus in mission as this heavy handed pressure thing. I think it's like, Jesus, and this is the kind of the spirit of Ephesians chapter 4 with the spiritual gifts there and a lot of the other places. Jesus, in his grace and his mercy, has gifted all of us with abilities and opportunities. And now we get to play the game with him. We
Yeah.
don't just sit on the sideline and watch. We actually get to play too. And that's the way I think we could picture it that way, that whatever our opportunities are, we get to join Jesus in playing this game called the kingdom of God and inviting people into it. Um, so I guess our encouragement to wrap up the episode is that's part of becoming like Jesus too, is saying, Jesus, how can I play the game with you? Open my eyes, help me to see. You're king, you're victorious over the dark powers. How can I be part of your victory celebration and your victory parade in this world? And let people know, hey, he welcomes all kinds, come on in too, and share that news with others. And so ultimately, As we've said over the last few weeks, being a disciple is arranging your life in such a way that you're going to be with Jesus in order to become like Jesus. And that likeness includes character, and that likeness includes mission, as we've talked about on this episode. So that's good stuff, Stephen. Thanks for prompting that conversation, getting us to think about that conversation. I think that's super helpful to people.
Great. Thanks, John.
Yeah. All right. As always, the Bible in Life is a listener-supported, crowd-funded Bible teaching ministry that's made possible by the generosity of all sorts of people just like you. So thanks a ton for your support. And if you want to join the team of supporters, if you've been blessed or impacted in any way, the easiest way to do that is just go to johnwhittaker.net, click the Give button. It'll redirect you to a page where you can set up a one-time or a recurring monthly donation. Thanks a ton for your support. Stephen and I look forward to talking with you again next week.